Welcome to Risking Enchantment, a podcast about art, beauty, and the Catholic faith. Hosted by Rachel Sherlock. Hello and welcome to Risking Enchantment. Joining me for this episode is Greg Daly. Welcome to the show.
Hi, thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to have you on. You've been a long-time supporter of the show, so it's great to have you on the show now. And Greg has been writing and tweeting about Risking Enchantment for a while, so it is entirely exciting to have him on the show. And I think we're also in a very fitting location. We are currently in the art room of the Catholic Library in Dublin, which is a really stunning place. I would recommend any Catholics in Dublin to come by. It's exactly what you would dream a Catholic library would be. It's all big wooden bookshelves towering up to the ceilings, filled with tomes and books and all kinds of wonderful things. It looks like it's a real kind of throwback building. It's stunning. And we're in the art room, which is, again, even more fitting because our topic for today is Vermeer, which, Greg, you picked out.
Yeah, Vermeer's kind of been a hobby horse of mine for the last probably 8 years or so. I was living in England at the time. There was a show on in Dulwich in London of a painting that's normally in the Queen's collection. And I went along, was enthralled by it, spent well over an hour staring at one painting. And then started doing a bit more reading about Vermeer, realised that there aren't that many Vermeers out there. There's just like 37 at most that we know of. And I thought, well, that's manageable. I can make it my mission in life to try and see all of these.
Yeah, there's something really appealing about a small collection that you can actually kind of get to grips with everything. I've been a fan of Vermeer for a long time. I studied him at secondary school. We actually did The Girl with the Pearl Earring as our novel for Leaving Cert, so got at least some of the cultural context, even if it's obviously a work of fiction. And then my brother actually lived in The Hague for a year, so I went to see him and I got to see a lot of the very famous paintings kind of up close and personal. And that was the thing I found most fascinating about where like The Girl with the Pearl Earring is held, is that it is just a painting on a wall. Like, I haven't been to see the Mona Lisa, but anytime I see it, it's like everyone's about 3 meters back. It was great to get to see it so up close and personal.
Yeah, I mean, that museum, the Mauritshuis, is particularly just a wonderful collection. You see like Carol Fabricius's Goldfinch on a tiny little corner tucked away.
Yeah.
And then you kind of go around that corner and you're in a room with, and it's not a particularly big room, with 3 Vermeers, one on each wall, or one on each of 3 walls.
Yeah.
And yeah, it's not like the swarms of people you see in the Louvre around the Mona Lisa or anything like that. It's really quite intimate. So you can stand there and unless you've got a brigade of school children, the odds are you've got these pictures more or less to yourself, and which is just a real privilege.
Yeah, I thought so. If I remember correctly, which I do remember it, but it almost seems so ludicrous that I'm questioning it. But the Girl with the Pearl Earring is just beside a doorway.
Yeah.
There's like... And, you know, it's beautifully set and you can really see it, but in the sense it's not sort of at the end of a great hall with all of the lights pointed at it. It is just one painting among many amazing paintings. It's funny, when a painting is sort of as famous as The Girl with the Pearl Earring, you kind of think it's got to be hyped up. It's got to be, like, it can't live up to the expectation. And to be honest, it does. We're not actually going to be talking that much about The Girl with the Pearl Earring, but I do love all of his paintings. But given how hyped up that was, I was kind of surprised that it was as mesmerising. And then, of course, my dad and I played a game for the rest of the day, which was a competition to see who could find the worst bit of Girl with the Pearl Earring merch, which it came down to a tie between, you know, those sort of water bottles, but they're almost like bags. Like they're not hard plastic, they're sort of soft plastic with it. And there was an entire luggage set with just her face across the whole front of the luggage set.
That's fantastic. I've got a photograph of me, like a selfie, where I'm holding an unusual piece of Vermeer merchandise, and it's a Girl with a Pearl Earring finger puppet. No, I didn't buy it, but I now regret not doing so.
Yeah, there's just something so kind of amusing to me about taking these amazing works of art and just plastering them across everything that is mundane and boring. And
absolutely.
They're great. And of course, both of us had the good fortune, you more so than me, to go to the National Gallery in Dublin. They had an exhibition of Vermeer's, which was really stunning.
Yeah, that was remarkable. We were probably never going to have anything like that in Ireland again on that scale. I mean, there were 10 Vermeers there, along with basically 50 other paintings by kind of contemporary Dutch masters from the time. So Vermeer, although he was like the pinnacle of Dutch art at that period, I would say, he doesn't exist in a vacuum. There's quite a lot of other people around the time. We've got in the National Gallery here 2 wonderful pictures by Metsu, Gabriel Metsu, but there's others, Ter Borch, De Hooch, all these others, and they all are kind of a matrix or constellation of artists who are all kind of competing with each other, looking at each other's work, getting ideas from each other, and yeah, it's just remarkable that we had that many here at that time.
Yeah, it was a really stunning exhibition. I was really blown away by that one. But like you said, I think he's a really interesting figure for being the most... I think he was rated the world's favourite Dutch painter. He kind of inched out Rembrandt in that. But I think he would arguably be one of the most iconic painters of all time. Like you said, it's kind of interesting to have that come from such a small collection of paintings. But of course, what we are going to be talking about for this podcast is actually the way in which these paintings have a rich Catholic heritage to them.
Yeah, it's Vermeer himself is a convert. I mean, that's probably kind of the key starting point on this one. The Netherlands at that stage was very anti-Catholic. A lot of it comes to do with it's not just the Reformation, it's also its kind of campaign for independence before that, when it became a republic. So Catholics tend to be viewed with suspicion. It's not illegal to be a Catholic at the time, but it's definitely frowned upon, and it's kind of an underground activity. There are churches, but they're in people's houses, for instance. That's pretty much the way it works. And Vermeer had been raised a typical kind of bog-standard Calvinist childhood. We know very little about his early life, but when he's 21, he gets married to a Catholic girl. I can never pronounce her surname, Katharina Bolnes. And between her and his mother-in-law, Maria Thins, who they live with in the Papist quarter of Delft, it's very clear that he's by no means a convert in name only. It's quite clear from his work that this is something he takes very seriously, and Catholic imagery and Catholic ideas permeate his art.
Yeah, it's really exceptional in that way. And just before we started, I was mentioning Rembrandt, who's sort of the other really famous Dutch painter. Obviously, there's hundreds of really amazing paintings that come out of this time, but Vermeer and Rembrandt are kind of the 2 names that stick out in people's minds. But obviously, Rembrandt was Protestant. I believe he moved around a lot of different... He was Mennonite at one point, and then... I think his mother was Catholic. He did come from at least partially Catholic family. His tutor, Lastman, was a Catholic, and there's a lot of things that kind of are informed by Lastman's work. He was very much, he was kind of as a student, he was very beloved of his tutor. He copied a lot of his paintings to begin with. But of course, he goes on to paint some of the really famous Christian paintings that we still have. I think probably the most famous one is the Prodigal Son.
Yeah, I think that'd be the obvious contender there.
Yeah.
There's quite a few kind of ones of like kind of temple scenes and stuff like that as well. They look quite opulent. But the Prodigal Son has that remarkable humanity, for want of a better phrase. You know, it's a very kind of profoundly compelling image of a welcoming father, a forgiving father.
Yeah, he's one of the few people I've kind of come across that does a lot of Old Testament paintings. He does the writing on the walls, I think. And he's not alone in this. There are other ones. There's a couple of really stunning crucifixion scenes that are coming out in this era. So it's not that there isn't Christian imagery at the time, but I suppose there's not necessarily the same kind of Catholic lens on a lot of it. And the interesting thing is, because obviously Vermeer has to in some ways disguise the fact that he is Catholic, and so he doesn't actually go for explicitly Christian imagery for the most part. We're going to look at a few exceptions to that rule, but a lot of what he does is sort of allegory through painting, which I find really moving. And so I think what we're going to do is really just kind of go through his paintings and talk about what he was doing with his paintings in terms of being Catholic as a painter. And I think it's so interesting, especially in our times, when I think a lot of Christian and Catholic art and media can be dismissed if it has that sort of Catholic label or Christian label, and in some cases rightly so, as being didactic rather than just artistic. And it's so exciting for me to see someone like Vermeer, who can have this global impact on the world and on all of art history, and be truly Catholic in what he's doing, but also not just saying, here's a picture of Christ and good luck, you know?
Yeah, no, very much so. Yeah, a lot of his better paintings, which have this kind of religious and particularly Catholic sensibility, yeah, it's not overt. The Catholicism is kind of under the wire. If you're Catholic yourself, if you bring a Catholic optic to it, you'll see what he's doing. But if you're determined not to do that, and if you might miss it altogether. It's in a strange way. You think of people like Tolkien or people like that as well. Loads of people enjoy Tolkien's work, and yet they clearly are getting it at what's the surface level without seeing what he wants to do with it.
When I was researching this episode, I actually came across an article which was very confidently and matter-of-factly putting forth, well, of course, Vermeer really detested his mother-in-law, Maria Thins, who forced him to put in all of this religious imagery. And I was just kind of baffled because there was no evidence that I could see, at least.
I hope he didn't detest her. He quite clearly depended on her to a very large degree. I mean, they're living in her house and they're dependent on... She's a very wealthy divorcee, actually. And she's got a large amount of land, which is able to keep the family going. And it's a big family. Vermeer and his wife have 15 children, 4 of whom die as very young. But so 11 children who live, if you like. And they all need feeding. And it's Maria Thins' wealth that basically makes this possible. Because Vermeer wasn't making a lot of money out of his paintings. He didn't paint that many.
I think I read that she also supported the Jesuit community quite extensively.
Yeah, I mean, like next door.
Yeah.
It was 1 or at most 2 doors down the street.
Yeah.
And you have this Jesuit house there. And I mean, it's striking that of the children of Vermeer and Catherine, 2 of the boys are called Ignatius and Francis. So they're getting these Jesuit names. So there's a very strong link in the family there.
Yeah, and like you said, it does seem to indicate in every possible respect that this was not a conversion in name only. He seems to have really taken it on. But I suppose the point about we're speculating this because we don't really know a lot about his life. You made a really interesting correlation between that.
Well, yeah, it's kind of funny. It's in a weird way, it's like the way we talk about the life of our Lord. In his hidden years, what was he doing between leaving his parents and going off to the temple and being found there when he's 12 and when he starts his mission, when he gets baptized? We just don't know. And yeah, it seems almost kind of sacrilegious to say it, but Vermeer, we know about his baptism. He was baptized on the day of his birth, 31st of October, 1632. And then we know nothing until he gets married, which appears to be over 2 dates in April 1653. There's a civil marriage.
Yeah.
And then, it's on the register. And then there seems to be a quiet religious ceremony about 3 weeks later. But yeah, we know basically nothing up to that. Now, and even then, to be honest with you, it sounds like we have mountains of information after that. We really don't. There are reasons why he got this nickname in the last century of being the Sphinx of Delft, that people just knew so little about him. And when you don't know much about people, there is a tendency to read into them.
Yeah.
And to kind of eisegesis rather than exegesis, to bring your own ideas in. And you have to be careful with doing that. But I really do think with Vermeer, you can track his religiosity and his use of religious imagery through the paintings they're kind of bookended by the most obviously religious ones, but there's an awful lot of them which are kind of latently or allegorically religious as well.
Yeah, and even just the fact that we don't know who he studied under and what influences he had before he sort of became quote-unquote Vermeer.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely the case too. There are kind of 5 major contenders for who he studied under, and there are arguments for and against every single one of them. The ones that look most persuasive are the ones who his art style bears no similarity to. So they kind of logistically fit, but they may just have been very freeing teachers. I always think when I was in primary school, all of my friends had a different teacher, and they all have the same handwriting to this day because they were cloned to write a certain way. Whereas the people in my class, well, we've got a variety of very diverse scrawls, So it is conceivable you can be under a teacher and not come across as a clone of that teacher. So it's possible. And one of those 2, at least, was a Catholic and may have encouraged him to study in Italy. We know that Vermeer is an expert in Italian art. In 1672, just a few years before his death, he's brought to The Hague with a few other artists to evaluate a group of Italian paintings. And he's brought there because he's recognised as an expert in Italian art.
And I think that's actually quite important because his subject matter is not Italianate, but the sort of language of painting that we're reading into it can often be fairly informed by the more Latin tradition of even like we're going to be talking almost like icons, that kind of language of painting is certainly there, and so we do have good reason to believe that obviously he would have been understanding this and wielding it to his own purposes, even if what he was painting was life in Delft.
Yeah. Well, I mean, his first overtly religious painting is one of the ones that looks Italian. It's a copy. The St. Praxedes, which is in Japan, it's a copy of a painting by Felice Ficciarelli. So Italian artist, was painted about 10 years earlier, probably somewhere around 1640, 1645. And Vermeer copies this one. So it's an early Christian saint and martyr, who was known for kind of gathering the relics of other martyrs. And so you have this painting of a woman crouching down, kind of mopping up blood. And the only real difference between this and the Italian original is that Vermeer's added the crucifix. He puts a crucifix into her hand, just to kind of underline what's going on here. So obviously that is Italianate, because it's a copy of an Italian painting. And to a point to which people didn't even think it was by Vermeer until very recently. It's probably still the most controversial one. But the people who argued it wasn't by Vermeer were convinced it was just another Italian painting. And very recently, in the last couple of years, really, last number of years, they've analysed the paint pigment in it. And it's certainly, they're Dutch paints from the mid-17th century. So it might not be Vermeer, but it's definitely not an Italian.
Yeah.
So
that's so interesting. And the fact that I think it is really interesting that that's the earliest one of his paintings that we have, starts us off on a road that then ends up looking very different, but is certainly informed by it.
Yeah, I mean, 1653 is when he gets married. So he's a Calvinist up to that point. We don't know how serious he was about it. He becomes Catholic to marry his wife. 2 years later, we have the St. Praxedes, we have Christ in the House of Mary and Martha, and even the Procuress, which is... A lot of art historians think this is meant to be seen as a scene from the prodigal son, though it's the prodigal son on his, getting his jollies before he kind of finds himself looking after pigs and needing to come home.
Yeah, the Procuress is the one of the woman with a man with his arms around her. There's sort of like a...
yes, and there's a young man turning and kind of smiling to camera, which a lot of people think may well be a self-portrait of Vermeer on that one.
Yeah, whereas a lot of his later paintings are very sedate and at least in some ways kind of virtuous, but this is definitely a more kind of rambunctious painting. Yeah,
very much so. His early paintings are also really big.
Yeah.
He starts doing these much smaller ones as he goes on, but those first few ones, and they're very much the kind of most prestigious type of paintings. I mean, his first three that we know of, you've got St. Praxedes, you've got Christ in the House of Mary and Martha, and you've got in The Hague, you've got the one of Diana and her handmaidens. These are big biblical scenes, big historical scenes, big mythological scenes.
Yeah.
And that's what you did if you were a really prestigious artist. And then he moves away from that. He moves into the field of genre painting mainly, where he's small scenes of everyday life. But there's more to them than that. And I guess that's where we're going today.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, I should probably say, we know that by 1657, I think, he definitely had done another big biblical scene painting, because it's mentioned in a guy's auction catalogue at the time. So he had done a scene called The Visit to the Tomb.
Isn't it so heartbreaking that we don't have that?
Yeah. But I mean, my background is ancient history, so I spend my time occasionally lamenting missing books of Plutarch and stuff like that. So you know about them. And at times you should just be grateful that we've got what we've got.
Yeah.
So many things just fall through cracks.
Absolutely. And even I think it's interesting to see the sort of biblical scenes, and the story of Mary and Martha is kind of an interesting one for him to have chosen as well. I don't necessarily know if there's a huge amount of paintings of that scene.
Yeah, I don't know. But I mean, again, art historians tend to think that what's going on here is that this is a comment on, it's basically him embracing Catholicism, because Mary and Martha tend to be seen as representatives of, respectively, faith and works, or the contemplative life and the active life. In kind of Protestant Dutch art, it would have been common to try and have them in such a way that Mary is clearly the right one and Martha is the wrong one, because it's faith alone. In this, he pulls them together. Christ is looking at one and gesturing to the other in such a way that it pulls the two together and shows that you need both. So faith without works being dead, essentially. So the two of them are joined. So it's a way of him kind of underlining his embracing of Catholicism.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love it. So what we're saying then is that moving on from those biblical paintings is the first one that we have that's more of a home life in Delft in the 1600s. The girl with a pearl necklace.
Yeah, usually the woman, I think. But yeah,
the woman
it's
with a pearl necklace.
which makes it easier to remember.
Yes.
If you call that one. Yeah, it's a remarkable painting. It was anybody who went to the exhibition in Dublin will have basically been kind of slapped in the face with this the minute you walk in.
Yeah.
It was in the first room that you were in, the entry room, and it was a series of what they call kind of toilet paintings. They're women getting ready to go out or something like that. So they've got little pictures of them with mirrors and with their makeup or whatever it would be. And there's a range of them from the time. Ter Borch is the real kind of innovator in this field, and then lots of people start modelling their stuff on him. So Vermeer's version of it is a woman in a yellow dress standing in front of a window, and a mirror is beside the window, and she's holding up a pearl necklace into the light. She's got this very kind of tranquil expression on her face, and she's holding this one up. And at the most basic level, this is simply a woman getting ready for the day or to go out. That's what it would be. But an American essayist called Siri Hustvedt put forward a very interesting idea some years ago that this is in fact an Annunciation painting. And in her essay on it, it's collected in a book called Yonder. In her essay on it, she talks about how she's at an exhibition. It's a press day, and there's a couple of leading Vermeer historians at the show, one of whom is Arthur Wheelock, who likewise came to the Dublin show. And she's looking at it, and she asks him, has anybody ever thought about this painting in terms of an Annunciation? And he kind of stops and smiles and then says, I've never thought about that before. That's very interesting. And he kind of frowns and says, I've always thought about it as a Eucharistic painting. And it turns out that the gesture of Mary's hands there, she's holding them up. It's not totally unlike, actually, Our Lady of Knock, that kind of pose.
You've already slipped into calling her Mary.
Yeah, I have. And, well, the thing is, I'm starting to see more and more of these, and I think they're Marian images. Yeah, it's certainly kind of, it's a praying gesture. She's holding the hands up as though she's praying.
There's almost like even her face is really fascinating to look at. It's not an expression that you're expecting. You think you might be smiling, or you think you would be like almost blank, but not passive. Like it's definitely engaged.
Yeah.
But she has this, it's almost like a determined face. But yeah, her lips are kind of almost parted in a gesture of reception almost. Very much. And she's looking at a mirror, which you have to be looking quite hard to see.
It's right beside the window on the wall there. It's worth bearing in mind that in Catholic thought, particularly at the time, it was quite common to talk about Mary as a reflection of God.
Yeah.
And that this is an image of a woman looking at a reflection shouldn't be ignored. Neither should the way the light is hitting her. Neither should the fact that this is a pearl necklace she's holding up. Pearls are seen as emblematic of Mary, in medieval art in particular. The idea is that, the shellfish opens itself up to something and then a pearl is brought forth.
Yeah.
Well, this is Mary opening herself up to the Holy Spirit, and the pearl will come forth.
Well, I was going to say, and I know this motif comes up in a lot of his other paintings, so I don't necessarily think this is completely accurate, but I also even love that in the foreground is this blue draped fabric, which almost feels like, because there's later paintings of women wearing blue, it's like she's not the Virgin Mother yet, but that blue fabric is sort of waiting for her.
Yeah, I think it's probably a very good way of looking at it. I think, the fabric is key in that way, and you see it in lots of other paintings. She will actually, if it is her, don the blue fabric later on. So, I think that image is there. What's striking is what she's wearing. She's wearing this bright yellow coat. Now, we see it in other paintings by Vermeer. He clearly has this kind of dressing up box, if you like, for the paintings.
Which I love. I love that you just see that kind of rotating dial of different things that he has in his house that crop up in all of the different images. It makes it so obvious that it's his home, which is very intimate and lovely.
So this kind of jacket then might be the kind of bed jackets that we definitely see in other paintings.
Mm-hmm.
And it leads to some debate actually about what's quite going on there. The question essentially becomes, is she pregnant or is she not? Because it definitely leans forward. The jacket looks as though it conceals or generates a bulge around her abdomen, raising the question at least about whether or not we're talking about pregnancy here.
Mm-hmm.
Pregnancy was clearly a fact of life in Vermeer's household. Himself and Katharina had over a 22-year period. We know of 15 pregnancies.
Mm-hmm.
There may have been others, but we know of 15. So the woman in his life was very commonly pregnant, so he would have seen this all the time. So that he should be painting a woman in a bed jacket who looks maybe or maybe not pregnant, that's his life.
And certainly I think it's interesting that Yeah, truly. But I think it's interesting that in this painting it's only barely a suggestion,
Yeah.
whereas there's other paintings that, like we said, there is an argument that there's kind of a fashion at the time, and maybe it was because women were pregnant and didn't want to sort of like they were trying to hide the fact that they were pregnant, and so then it became fashionable to have these coats that make you look kind of vaguely pregnant. It is very debated, and if you think maybe we're sort of overstating it, I did look into this, and I kind of can't overstate how completely uncommon it was to ever depict a woman pregnant in art. That it was just not the done thing at all. So the fact that there is this question about whether they're pregnant, but like I said, that this is clearly a relatively younger woman, and only the barest hint of whether she's pregnant or not. Yeah, it's stunning, and she's so radiant. It's hard to, even if you look up the pictures online, you get a sense of it, but having seen it in person, you just can't get over how that yellow really jumps out of the painting.
Yeah, at the time when I saw it in Dublin, I went to the exhibition 4 times, and I've since seen the painting again in Berlin, and it glows. It's basically a luminous painting, and I've got photographs of it, which I took because I was there on the press day, and it stands out from every painting around it. There's just this kind of luminous painting that just slaps you when you look at it. It's very, very hard to look away. And that luminous quality is particularly curious when you think of how bare the painting is.
Yeah.
The painting is a very, very dark foreground with a table on it. When you can see a bit of the table, you can see the blue cloth that Rachel referred to. And you've basically got a giant slab of white background with this woman standing against it. It looks like nothing quite so much as an icon.
Yeah.
And you would often find, quite often Vermeer does paintings, and we know from looking at them now with various kind of ultraviolet light and stuff like that, that there were extra details, and then he just painted them out.
Yeah, I think there was meant to be a sort of hanging behind her or something like that. And in a lot of the paintings, there's maps and there's paintings that stand behind these women who are getting ready or whatever it is that they're doing. But this is just blank. And what it really reminds me of is the Fra Angelico Annunciation, because it feels like she's off center. It feels like there should be another person that she's facing. And have like the blank space in between them, but obviously, like we said, it's a wall, it's a window, and it's a mirror, but it is just a wall that she's facing. So she's almost like this kind of relatively small detail in a very blank space around her.
Yeah, I think that's definitely the way to look at it, and it is remarkable in that respect. Even it's worth saying that again, you got to be careful not to overplay these things.
Mm-hmm.
But you'll find people talking about the fact that the light shines in at an angle, that it strikes her at an angle at her abdomen. It's coming down, and I think that's correct. I mean, you can see that. Now, Vermeer likes to paint light coming in from roughly that angle because he tends to have the window at that side of the painting. Yeah. So some of these things just follow. But again, if you're thinking of it as a possible annunciation, well, the pearls are an image there, and the mirror is an image of Mary, and the light coming in and hitting the womb, essentially, really looks like this is what it is. This is a scene of Mary's fiat, Mary's yes.
And speaking of small details, and I honestly took about 10 minutes to find it because I haven't told about it, but even knowing I was looking for it, I couldn't find it. There is a very tiny detail of what looks like an egg-like shape on the window, which you would just assume is part of the architecture in some way, if it hadn't been for the fact that Vermeer paints this window over and over again, and it's not in any of the other paintings.
Yeah, that's exactly it. I mean, looking at it, if I noticed it at all, I just thought it's the way the wood worked.
Yeah.
But and again, it was pointed out to me, Vermeer clearly paints a lot of paintings in this room, and we never see this again. Yeah. So, essentially, he has painted a small egg in the kind of discreet little corner of the room.
Yeah.
And the egg obviously is a symbol of new life, of pregnancy, and of Christ himself coming forth. I mean, we don't have eggs at Easter for nothing.
And as you will see if you're looking at Vermeer paintings, there are immense amounts of tiny little details that do have meanings. Like, people who don't see this as an Annunciation image point to the sort of hairbrushes and various toiletries around her as perhaps being a sign of vanity or something like that, that you can look at any of the little details in these images and pull out meaning from them. And later on we'll be talking about specifically the books of iconologia that he would have referred to in order to make his painting. So it's not insubstantial to point out these little details that are in there.
Yeah, no, I think that's very true, and it's important to look at them that way. I mean, they do allow for other interpretations. It's a bit, and again, I'm mentioning Tolkien, but it's a bit like the way he says he doesn't want his work to be a simple allegory. You know,
Yeah.
you can read it in different ways. It's not a straightforward, this means this equals
Yeah.
this. It's richer than that, and it's more kind of multivalent, multifaceted
Yeah.
in its symbolism.
Well, I guess we should go on to another painting.
Yeah, I think the next one, pretty much more or less, kind of looking at the note in order. If you probably hear the pages turning here for what it's worth. I've got a very large book of Vermeer paintings
Which is
in front of me.
Stunning. I'm really jealous of it.
It's very cheap, this one, it's probably because of the lack of text in it. Each one has a small description, but a wonderful large picture. So, yeah, the woman holding a balance is painted around the same time, kind of early 1660s. And what we have is a woman wearing the same kind of jacket, but this time it's a dark blue one, possibly the same cloth that Rachel was talking about in the previous painting. It's a woman with a white kind of shawl and a dark blue jacket holding up a very small and empty balance. She's doing it while facing what's probably the same window with the same yellow curtain beside it.
And she's wearing yellow underneath her.
She is wearing yellow underneath, exactly. And then she's got the table in front of her. So it's very much, it's the same
setup.
Same setup. He's hung a painting on the wall this time, and the painting is of the Last Judgment. Mm-hmm. And that's going to be key to the meaning of the scene.
Yeah. And at least to me, she looks very pregnant.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. Because, I mean, you can argue that, well, no, these jackets were just a style. But in this one, you can actually see what looks like a swollen belly in the yellow dress below the jacket.
Yes, it's not just the jacket, it is also the dress. I would really encourage anyone listening to look up these paintings, but the face that he has painted is one of such radiant beauty. It is really transfixing, and I think anyone with any experience in Catholic art would at a glance look at that face, just even the face out of all of the other contexts, but especially with the sort of shawl around her hair, the blue, it looks like a Marian face, and it leaps out of the painting. The difference between this one and the previous one is whereas there was heaps of light kind of coming through the window, this time it's very much obscured, it's very dark, except for this one kind of beam of light coming from the top corner straight onto her face.
And lighting the bump as well. The bump, because her yellow clothes are they look kind of yellow ochre, kind of mustard coloured, and except for the little sliver of it you see where the jacket is open at the front, and it's a golden orange in that light. So, but yeah, it's very much, it's a classically Marian face. It's contemplative, it's tranquil, and it's concentrating.
Yeah, and you know, she's sort of surrounded by jewellery and what looks like coins.
Well, you've got the pearls again.
Yes.
Pearls are there. You can also see the mirrors up on the wall again as well. So again, maybe that's because the mirror is always on the wall, but nonetheless.
Yes.
Vermeer doesn't always paint things. You know, he can remove it if he wants to. If he thought that wasn't relevant, it'd go. And then you've got this, and the picture of the woman kind of with the scales is a classic image anyway. I mean, that would be an image of kind of responsibility and prudence. You know, that's the classic kind of thing. Except that we have this large image of the Last Judgment behind. And I gotta say Mary again, the woman's face is obscuring St. Michael, who would be given the role of separating the sheep from the goats, basically, at the end. That's his job, to kind of do the kind of practical work in a way. And she's there instead, holding up a balance instead. So as though to say, this is a matter of judgment, this is a matter of conscience. In fact, this particular box that she has, regularly, like that kind of jewellery box that we see on the table, regularly would have had images of conscience as an individual depicted on the front of it. So it's a picture about judgment, about careful discernment, and about weighing things up very carefully, and doing so in the context of this being a religious act, really, this being a profoundly moral and religious act.
Yeah, well, it's just stunning. I love that painting.
I think that's pretty much the last one that you would have seen in the Dublin exhibition, actually. It was in the last of the 5 rooms, I think.
Yeah, they might have done that, actually.
They put it side by side with a similar, well, I say similar, a similar painting by de Hooch. I'm an enormous fan of Pete de Hooch's work, and he does some things that other artists can't even get close to. Whenever he has a picture of a house, there's always like a door in the house leading through to another room, or maybe a room and then a garden, and people in that, and you have an extraordinary sense of depth going on in his. But when you put his woman with a balance side by side with Vermeer's woman with a balance, and his one's wearing a blue mantle with white fur around it and all that as well, it looks like an amateur student compared to him. You know, and he's not. He's a phenomenal artist. But next to Vermeer, it just looks uninspired and crude even.
Yeah. And I think there's such wonderful paintings to meditate on. And the fact that, like we're saying, it's not necessarily so overtly religious, but that there's so much space for contemplation there.
Yeah, I mean, Arthur Wheelock talks about this a lot, the tranquility and the quietness of the painting. There's a tendency for people just to fall silent around these and just kind of gaze into them. They work in some ways like icons in that sense. And I almost think if you wanted to treat them as icons, you could. You know, they do come across as almost prayers in the form of art. I think that's what he's doing there. So...
and certainly, and when you consider, like we were saying, he was surrounded by Jesuits and Jesuit influence, and we see some more of that in the later paintings, but that sense of contemplation and that sense of self, like reflection, would have been something that he would have actually been trained in. So the fact that it comes out in his paintings, despite living in a house with 10 plus kids, is kind of telling.
Yes, to produce such tranquility in a house that must have been just uproarious the whole time,
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very good point.
So we can move on to yet another woman in blue standing at a window. As you can see, it is something of a theme.
I've got a folder on my computer where I just have all the Vermeer pictures together, and the option where you can kind of pull them up as thumbnails all at the same time gives you a real sense of how many of these have a similar composition and how he's doing they're almost kind of Goldberg variations. They are these variations on a theme. So it's very, very easy to look at this and just go, oh, it's just another picture of a woman standing on her own, just doing something quiet. And it is that, but I would balk at the words just another. There's something much more going on in this one. It's a very simple, very still image, which is probably an inspiration long-term for people like Mondrian with their rectangles in their art, big bright colours and rectangles. And you can kind of abstract this down very simply. But I think here we're looking at, again, another enunciation. A woman reading a letter is obviously somebody getting a message. She's wearing her blue jacket. That makes her look a bit more Marian than before. This one surely is pregnant. Again, you have this bulge in the jacket. I mean, she's got her hands in at her side, and yet it kind of bulges out at the base. Her jacket bulges out. I think it's a pregnancy image. And again, you've the light coming in and striking her, and her receiving a message. So on the face of it, and again, you've got the pearls on the table in front of her. So it does seem to kind of tally with regular Annunciation images. I'd almost say it's a more stressful image than the...
There's a map behind her which almost kind of suggests going on a journey. I know another one of the readings of this painting is receiving news of a husband who is out sailing or out travelling, and so there's that kind of sense of travel with the map behind her. But there is that kind of, like you said, that she looks more perturbed in this one. She looks more like the woman with the pearl necklace than the previous painting, which does look like a very different woman. This one looks a bit more similar, but it's not quite a furrow of the brow, but there's a sort of look of apprehension.
Whitened knuckles as well.
Yeah.
There's a tenseness around the hands there. She's receiving this message. So I'm not saying it's not good news or it's bad news or anything like that, but it's not news to be taken lightly. Whatever is in this letter is not to be taken lightly.
Yeah. It does look like a woman who is pondering it greatly in her heart.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's fair. One other thing I would say about it, which is kind of remarkable, is she doesn't cast a shadow. Vermeer is very, very interested in light, and the effects of a lot of his paintings are such that people regularly consider whether he may have used a camera obscura, this kind of primitive form of camera, to guide him while making his paintings. Whether or not that's true, he's a man who understood light, he knew how it worked, and often referred to as a master of light. And that makes it all the more striking that we look at this picture and you can see the chair by the table, and that casts a shadow onto the wall. The map is casting a shadow, and the woman herself is properly sculpted, if you like. She has shadow around her. She's sculpted, she's painted in the round. Mm-hmm. But there's no shadow behind her. So it's as though the light that's coming is passing through her with no taint at all. Mm. If you wanted an image for somebody who's free from original sin, a person with no shadow, okay, you might say that's a vampire as well. But I think it's important because it's not accidental.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really true. I love that. Greg mentioned the pearls that are... He sort of goes to an enormous length to have a tiny corner of a table that just happens to have pearls on it. It would be so much easier to leave that off. So, they're not there for nothing equally.
No, I think that's got to be it. Again, he leaves so much out.
Yeah.
that we have to think about what he's leaving in. And sometimes he leaves things in for colour balance and stuff like that. That's the case as well.
Yeah.
But that's a really small bit of table. It's a really tiny detail. It doesn't have to be pearls. Why does he do that? It's meant to be able to tell us something about the person reading this letter. The astronomer, it's probably worth looking at just for a second.
Oh, good. Those were the paintings that sort of surprised me most in the exhibition. I didn't recognise them at all, and I actually really liked them. And you do kind of get into a conspiracy nuthead theory where you're looking at these paintings and saying, well, what's the religious symbolism of this one then? And obviously you can take that too far, but do really like these paintings, and I think they're kind of interesting ones to look at because they're a set of two.
The astronomer and the geographer.
And the geographer.
And one's normally in Frankfurt, and the other one's normally in Paris. So we were very lucky to get them both side by side.
It's tragic that they're not put together. That's so sad.
Yeah, it's remarkable when that happens. The Rijksmuseum in Amsterdam and the Louvre, for instance, have a deal where they've both got a painting by Rembrandt of a couple who just got married. So one of them has the man, the other has the woman. And now they do it so that they go, one of them will have them for 2 years and they pass them over, and then the other one has it. So they stay together, but they move.
Yeah.
And I kind of wish they could do something similar with these because they belong together.
Yeah, they do.
So very, very small religious detail in the astronomer one, but it is important. Behind him, he's got a picture on the wall, and you have pictures quite often on the wall in Vermeer paintings. It's a picture of Moses being found as a baby. It's not very obvious that that's a picture of Moses being found. It looks kind of like blur if you look at it in isolation.
Yes.
But you see it much more clearly and on a much larger scale in the Dublin painting of the woman writing a letter with her maid. And it is quite clearly the same painting if you put them side by side. So going straight to the Dublin painting, then again, this is from Vermeer's kind of mature period. It's definitely one of his later paintings. They think it's probably done around 1670, so just before the family faces financial ruin. And you've got a woman writing a letter at a desk, and she's concentrating hard writing this letter. In front of her, you could see a crumpled letter, which may have been a previous one, a previous attempt that didn't work. You can see a bit of wax and a sealing stick for these letters, and she's basically writing in a frantic way. She doesn't look frantic. Vermeer doesn't really do frantic, but you know that there's an urgency about it from these bits of paraphernalia on the ground. Behind her, you've got her maid looking out the window, and it's the same standard thing. The light is coming in at the same angle. We know how Vermeer works. And on the wall behind her is an enormous painting of the finding of Moses. The painting here, in a sense, this isn't a Catholic painting, but it's where Christian imagery is useful for understanding the painting. This is, in many ways, it's a genre painting. There's a whole series of them. Vermeer has 6 pictures of women writing or reading letters. It's very much of the era. It's probably a love letter. That tends to be the way this genre works. And if you put a picture in the background, the picture within a picture is usually intended to give you a sense of what's really happening. And in this case, you've got the sense that whatever happens, it's in God's hands. It's down to providence. So the woman may be worried herself. She may be kind of tossing things off her desk in a hurry and maybe knocking them over. But behind her, there's an image of, don't worry, God will make this come to good. No matter what's happening, he will find good in it. So that's the kind of imagery that he's working with there. Just taking a religious image and plonking it into a very humdrum everyday scene.
And so do you think that has any kind of bearing on the geographer then? Or sorry, the astronomer?
The astronomer, I don't know. I don't know. I would be inclined to say yes if there were more of that painting in it. As it stands, I mean, he might just think it works for balance in that picture because you don't have the whole painting in that one. You've just got a little bit of it. I mean, I honestly don't think you would know it's the finding of Moses if you didn't already have a bigger picture of the finding of Moses to compare it with. So the meaning of it isn't as obvious, and you'd have to dig pretty deep on that one. True. People aren't even sure who it is in those paintings. Some think it's Vermeer himself. Some think
because it's the same man in both.
Yeah, it's definitely the same man. I mean, some people, I can never pronounce his name, but Van Leeuwen, the guy who basically invents the microscope. And he's another kind of celebrated citizen of Delft in Vermeer's time. So it's an era of kind of huge experimentation with lenses. Spinoza is working on them at the same time. And Holland is ahead of the curve with everybody in doing this kind of work. So it's quite possible that it was Vermeer's friend who's then posing for both of these pictures.
That's very, very cool. I like that a lot. If I could have my absolutely harebrained conspiracy theory way with it, I would love to have someone come up with a theory for why that might be one of the wise men. I think just because we're coming out of Christmas, I've been thinking about astronomers and geographers a lot and who that kind of combines in. But obviously, that's just me having fun.
Yeah, and yet, I don't think it's something to rule out of hand.
Yeah.
Because, although if that's the case, I would like to see a third painting.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking, yeah. I was like, is there a missing one? But once you've had, you probably need the traveller then. The astronomer, the geographer, and the traveller.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah.
No, it's a very, very, very tempting idea. I almost wish you hadn't said that. I'm going, I wonder, could it be?
Could it possibly be? No, like I said, I think that's just for fun for me, but...
Yeah, I mean, it is worthwhile, I think, that there are genre paintings of these, but there aren't many. I remember in that room, in the exhibition they had in Dublin, there was only like one other geographer painting or one other astronomer, and they were tiny. So, yeah, it was a thing people painted, but they didn't paint them all the time. Whereas the other rooms might have 6 or 7 on a theme.
Yeah, exactly, yeah. No, there was definitely a lot more of the images of hallways leading to people cleaning or writing or playing music. Those are all fairly common.
Yeah, and whereas these are... They kind of felt crowbarred in a way. It's like they had a chance of getting these two paintings together and they were going to make sure they had something to match them.
Yeah.
Like by hook or by crook, they're getting these. Then I think it's probably worth going to the one where I go into kind of crazy conspiracy theory mode on this one, but I think I'm right, which is The Lace Maker. Definitely an absolute masterpiece by Vermeer. It's very small.
It's interesting because obviously it is of a girl making lace, but the kind of intricate detail of the work that she's doing is sort of mimicked in the intricate size of the work that he's doing on the canvas.
Well, it's the size of... It's smaller than this book, I'll tell you. It's it's 8.5 inches by 9.5 inches, roughly. So a bit smaller again. So it's remarkable. It's a picture of a woman concentrating. She's doing some kind of lace bobbin work. She's embroidering there. She's wearing a yellow dress. Her hands are kind of deftly working away at the needles. And beside her, on a little table, you've got a cushion, which is actually, it's a sewing box in the form of a cushion, with some thread coming out the side of it, and you've got a book on the table with some ribbon kind of markers in it. Now, the first thing I need to say is that, in fairness, it is possible that the book is a pattern book for lace making. That's got to be said, because to not say that at the beginning is... It's kind of... It's loading the deck in a way. That's not right. But the book that would have been most common at the time is quite clearly the Bible. It would have been a staple of so many Dutch houses. And statistically speaking, if you see a book and a picture, Bible should be your first guess because it's the most common book. So if you know then that in medieval art in particular, embroidery is seen as a typical activity or occupation for Mary as a young woman. It's seen as this image of her being industrious and persevering and careful. So again, you go, oh, could this then be a Marian image? And I think it is. In fact, the more you look at it, the more you see it. It's again, you start staring at these and they become icons for you. You know, the big clear background or the close-up of a woman's face.
Yeah.
But the one that really strikes me about this, and the precise symbolism of it, I do not know, but I think it's real, is that when you look at the cushion in the foreground, there's thread coming out the side of the cushion. And people always talk about this thread, the way Vermeer's painted it in a strange liquid way. It almost looks as though the paint has been poured on the canvas. And in a way, it doesn't really look like thread. If you just got a small picture of, just like if you zoomed in on the face of the woman with the balance, if you zoom in on these and didn't know anything else, you wouldn't guess it was thread. It just doesn't work that way. What you see are what looks like two streams of liquid.
Yeah.
One of which is red and one of which is white. And when you start talking about them that way, saying, we've got red and white streams coming out of the side. Yeah. Everybody who has even a hint of Catholic iconography in them goes, hang on a minute.
I recognise that.
Yeah, exactly. It's the standard, it's the image for, typically, whether it's the blood and the water coming from our Lord's side and the cross, that being a symbol of the birth of the church, that also being a symbol of baptism and the Eucharist. Because you don't have to be red and white thread. And they certainly don't have to look like liquid.
Because she also doesn't look like, she looks like she's working with white, but the red is really incongruous with the rest of the painting.
Yeah, it's outstanding. I mean, in a very literal sense, it's a remarkable colour to use there. And probably, red doesn't pop up often in Vermeer paintings. You see a very, very, very dark red on the kind of oriental rugs that sometimes decorate the tables. But other than that, red is more or less absent, except for the blood that St. Praxedes mops up, except for the blood of the snake, which we will see in a moment in the allegory of faith. But this just looks like blood and water coming from the side of the cushion. The cushion has a name which kind of the word kussen in Dutch actually means kiss as well. So there isn't a possibility there to kind of that this is kind of a love symbol in a way. But again, you got to be, when you're working with this kind of what seems to be a deeply private and personal kind of set of allegorical images, you've got to be careful not to kind of overplay your hand. But I do think it's striking. You've got a young woman zoomed in, close up on her. It's very much just a close up painting, like an icon of Our Lady's face, basically.
Yeah.
Where she's doing an activity which is typical in paintings of Mary in medieval art, and then you have this kind of Christ image at the side in the streams of blood and water.
Yeah, and it's a painting that really does draw you in, and her face is in shadow, which then really focuses you on her hands. There's a quote from Paul Claudel, who I've referenced before in this podcast. I find him quite interesting. He was the person who was converted upon walking into Notre Dame on a Christmas Eve and hearing them sing their hymns. And, you know, that he's kind of famous for that, being that person who's converted by beauty. But he is a quote on Vermeer. The first part is just him sort of gushing about Vermeer, and then he goes on to speak about the lace maker. He says, "There is one, I shall not say greater, for here it is not a question of greatness, but more perfect, more rare, more exquisite. And, if other adjectives were necessary, it would be those offered to us only by the English language: eerie, uncanny. You have been expecting his name for a long time, Vermeer of Delft. Look at the lace maker in the Louvre, busy over her frame, whose shoulders, head, hands, with their fingers like two workshops, are all concentrated on the point of the needle, or that pupil in the centre of the blue, which is the focal point of the whole face, of her whole person, a sort of spiritual coordination, a ray of lightning discharged from the soul."
That's remarkable. Where did you come across that? That's great.
It was in something called Salmagundi magazine.
Oh.
But yes, no, I love that quote.
Salvador Dali was another person who was obsessed with this painting.
Really? And we talked about Daly when we were talking about Bring Back Catholic Weirdness.
No, he was obsessed with it, and also bizarrely obsessed with rhinoceroses, and he saw the two being linked in a very weird way. There's one of his events, he did a thing where it was in a film that was shown actually in Dublin around the time of the exhibition, and they had a big replica of the lace maker put up beside a rhinoceros, like Paris Zoo or something like that, and he was hoping the rhinoceros would spear it with its horn. It didn't. And then he got like a lance somehow and cycled on his bicycle, so he speared it himself.
This is an entirely suitable story for Salvador Dali.
Well, yeah, and it does again go, do you really want Catholic weirdness back? Is that what we need?
Yeah, that's maybe taking it a little far. But yes, no, it's a very kind of, it's almost a strange painting. It doesn't feel like a lot of his other paintings. It's still very recognisably Vermeer, but it's the sort of close up, there's almost like a claustrophobic element to it.
The intimacy is remarkable. I mean, he does quite a few very intimate pictures of women that way, and not just the ones where they're getting ready and they're holding the necklace and so forth, but if you look at the maid asleep at the table, if you look at the milkmaid or the one with a water pitcher, something you kind of not expect to see, they're not kind of voyeuristic, but there's an intimacy. But this goes further again. This is like zooming right in. I mean, all you can see is basically head and upper torso where the hands happen to be. And they're very large in this very small painting. They pick up a large portion of
her hands, because a lot of the paintings of the women, their hands are quite dainty. Her hands are very big in this painting.
Yeah, they're very prominent.
Yeah. Actually, yes, and speaking of Claudel, I actually have another quote from him, which I think maybe refers to some of our earlier paintings with the woman looking in the mirror, but it's just he just puts it so well. He says, "At the touch of Vermeer's brush, the canvas transforms, so to speak, into a spectral silver-backed mirror, into a magical retina," writes Claudel. who goes on to explain that through this dematerialization and this freezing of time, which are caused by such a mirror and its underlay of silvery shimmering glass, we are elevated from the realm of reality into the paradise of essentiality. Such an effect can only be compared with the precious wonders of the camera obscura. So that was the camera-like device that you were talking about. But I think even when you were talking about how the woman reading the letter doesn't cast a shadow and that freezing moment in time, I think that is what makes these paintings so captivating in a very unique way, which I think actually leads us to our last painting, I believe.
That's right. And if up to now we've been talking about simplicity and clarity and so forth, you can forget all of that now.
Yep, it goes all out the window for the last one.
It's 1671 or thereabouts. It's one of his last paintings, maybe 2, 3, 4, 1674 at the latest, just before his death. And it's as though he suddenly realised that he's living in the Baroque period. And he throws everything at this painting, which is the allegory of faith, or the allegory of Catholic faith.
Yes, as it's properly called.
Certainly that's the most accurate description of it, because it's a profoundly physical, image-ladle, symbol-ladle, incarnational work.
Mm-hmm. And there's so many elements to this. Like, whereas we were kind of picking up on tiny elements and pulling meaning out from this, this one just has meaning everywhere you look.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to know where to start with this one. You've got a curtain in the foreground pulled back, so you're looking into a scene. And you've got a woman dressed in blue and white with her foot upon a globe, standing on a kind of raised kind of dais. Behind her is a large painting of the crucifixion. Hanging over her is a large glass ball. On the table next to her, if it is a table and not an altar, we see a Bible, a chalice, a crucifix, and if you really squint to go up close, an actual crown of thorns, which is just there.
That is, barely there.
Barely there. And then on the ground in front of her, you've got a serpent which is bleeding because it's been crushed by a large rock or big block of wood.
There also seems to be an apple.
And yeah, exactly. There's an apple with, it looks like a bite taken out of it.
And the woman has her foot up on a globe, which I find fascinating. And there's so much going on. She's wearing a string of pearls. She's doing a lot of, like we said, there's a lot going on in this painting. Anyone who kind of reasonably assesses this painting suggests that it is their sort of home church. It looks like a chapel of some kind.
Yeah, one of those kind of private ones in one of the houses, certainly. It's generally thought this is done as a commission, and not just Vermeer having fun. And it's very. I mean, it is clearly atypical. It is the most convoluted and complicated of his works in many ways, and a lot of people think it doesn't work because of that. And I think it's because we like the simplicity of Vermeer paintings.
Yeah.
And there is no simplicity in this one.
Nope. But there's so much to kind of pull out from it. I know, obviously, we've been talking and suggesting, even in describing it, that maybe this woman is Mary, and certainly there's a lot of things to indicate it. It's interesting that, from what I can tell, she's in the same kind of gesture as Mary in the painting behind her. There's that kind of leaning head to one side. But I have also been reading from Elizabeth Lev's book how that particular gesture was also fairly common in depictions of Mary Magdalene.
Okay.
Of like leaning back on the breast of our Lord.
And it's not, I mean, I've wondered if it's simply the church itself. The
yes.
church, although, of course,
it could
behold
be.
your mother and so
yes.
forth, Mary as church. Yeah, I mean, the Marian colour is there, but at the same time, Mary as church is probably the way to go, but in this kind of slightly Marian pose. I mean, I think that makes sense there.
Yeah. And then, of course, you've got the snake being crushed by what must be the cornerstone.
Yeah, no, I think that has to be it. I think that's a fair one there. So,
and then when we were discussing it, we were also saying that, as I mentioned earlier, Vermeer draws from this book. I think it's called the Iconologia, which in our episode that we discussed sort of various Marian imagery, I was saying how we've lost the language of the flowers, but also I think in another way we've lost this really rigorous training in what symbolism can be used in art and in paintings, and this would be an example. But classically, I believe that would it be the chalice in the Bible as a symbol of faith? Yeah,
but I think it goes further. Well, actually, yes, that's true. Chalice and the Bible certainly would be. But
and then he added the different elements to it to make it more explicitly the Mass and the Eucharist.
Yeah, I mean, that's really what he's hammering home. You've got a Bible on a table is just a Bible on a table. It's the proclamation of the Word.
Yeah.
But you put the chalice there, and that's the blood of Christ. And in case you've got any doubt that the Mass is the crucifixion, that you're going to, it's a representation of the crucifixion, you've got a crucifix there, and you have what appears to be the actual crown of thorns,
Yeah.
which is, I think, the most subtle detail in the whole thing, unless there's bits I haven't spotted, and given that you can barely see that, I'm kind of suspect there may be other things you can barely see in this painting, but the crown of thorns, it's hammering home the Mass is a real thing. This is a real sacrifice, rather than it's not simply a reenactment in some kind of symbolic way. This is real.
Very much so. And then speaking of details you can almost not see, there's a blue ribbon that comes down, which rather helps you to see perhaps the strangest detail of all, which is this glass sphere that's hanging above, and that the woman in the painting is clearly looking into. And I believe if you go close enough, although someone was making a point that this is more a gesture towards his real Protestantism, this was the article I was referencing earlier, but you can see the landscape of Delft with the church in the landscape. It's a little bit hard to see here, but you can see it online.
Yeah, okay.
But it's a very enigmatic symbol, which people have generally kind of gestured at it being something to do with contemplation and the kind of infinity of the soul, and perhaps more Jesuit practices of reflection. Yeah,
and kind of man's capacity to contemplate and to believe in God. That seems to be part of the idea too. Although again, if you squint very closely at the globe, well, you really need kind of to have it enlarged, but it's kind of reflecting the studio in it. There's hints of his studio going on there, and if that's the case, it's the notion of, well, he's an artist who's creating.
Yeah.
And it's the artist as God in that way.
That's a lovely way to look at it as well.
I mean, you might even, and I probably should have mentioned this one, because the art of painting, which is one of his most famous ones, you have this very curious scene where you have
a painting of a man painting.
A painting of a man painting, but that's a muse or a god.
Yeah.
And this is his human rendering of a muse or god. There's almost a sense in which the easel is the artist's altar in that one, when he's looking at God and then trying to make God present in a way on paper or on canvas.
Yeah, no, that's a lovely way of looking at it.
And that's one of those paintings as well where you have the curtain kind of pulled back and you're looking into a scene. There is definitely a similarity between the two.
Yes, and they're the most kind of, like you said, Baroque pictures of his, and the most symbolism heavy. And I think that was actually a point I was going to make at the end to kind of round up what we were saying is him making God present. I think what's so lovely about it is that the kind of incarnational quality of it, like, yes, Christ came to Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, and that was a fact of history. But in breaking into time in that way, he is also broken into all time, and that we can encounter Christ in the humdrum every day, reading a letter, putting on a string of pearls, balancing up your coins, that these really practical, what you would say almost mundane paintings can be something that brings us to encounter God, because God is an actual reality within our world and not just separate from it, which I think is really nice. Yeah,
I think it's there's that classic thing that people talk about Catholic art being kind of immanent. It emphasizes the immanence of God rather than the transcendence of God. And that's what you see in a lot of Vermeer's paintings. I mean, some of them, they're pretty obvious that you're getting a religious painting.
Yeah.
But other ones, they're cases where he's sacramentalizing the everyday.
Yeah.
And is very much ahead of his time in doing so. That's the kind of thing you'll find writers doing in the 19th and 20th century and so forth. But he's doing it in the mid-17th in art.
What it actually reminded me of, and I came across the quote because I was reading a review of Terrence Malick's new film, A Hidden Life, which I have not had the good fortune to see yet.
No, me neither. I'm afraid of 3 hours in a cinema.
But the title, A Hidden Life, comes from a quote from George Eliot, talking about the sacramental everyday. And the quote is, "For the growing good of the world is partly dependent on unhistoric acts, and that things are not so ill with you and me as they might have been is half owing to the number who lived faithfully a hidden life and rest in unvisited tombs." And I think that is also kind of at the heart of what Vermeer does, is that these simple lives, because actually one of the ones we didn't talk about, and it's not specifically sacramental painting as far as any mad conspiracy theorist has come up with, but The Little Street is one of my all-time favourites. It's just at the front of a house and of an alleyway beside it, and people, sitting in the doorway and sweeping the alley, and it's such a humble, quiet painting, and I really love that one. But there is that really, despite not having any overtly sacramental imagery in it, it has that peace and tranquility and virtue in it as well, which I love.
It's his only painting with children in.
That's so interesting.
They found the house recently, a few years ago. Yeah, the trick is it's actually 2 alleys. And there's a tax book that they have from like late 17th century Delft. And the tax book, one of the things, you're being taxed on your access points to the canals. And there's only one house that has 2 alleys doing this. And then when they went there,
so fascinating.
All the skylines match up with what the background of that spot. And this house was owned by Vermeer's aunt.
There you go.
So, who that probably is sitting doing her knitting in the doorway.
And that's it. That's how like real and practical Vermeer's paintings are. That they are just his like we said, his box of props and costumes, his corner of the room that he paints 1,000 times, or rather just only 37 times. Yes. But that these are kind of his lived inhabited spaces that he's sort of bringing this deeper meaning into, which is so lovely. But I think that's pretty much all we were hoping to touch on.
I'd say so, yeah. It's been fairly comprehensive, I think.
Yeah, well, I loved it. I thought it was so much fun to kind of dive into how someone so known in terms of art history and in history in general can bring this kind of Catholic lens to how we understand it. It's just wonderful. I have to ask you the question we always ask: what are you enjoying at the moment?
What am I enjoying at the moment? Well, it's good you mentioned George Eliot because I'm reading Middlemarch.
I've never read Middlemarch.
I'm about a quarter of the way into it. And I like it a lot. That's all I think. I think I need to accelerate my reading of it, though, and just kind of knock out a couple of 100 pages very quickly to just get fully immersed in that world. But she's absolutely remarkable novelist. I mean, goes without saying, I suppose. But it's very special. So
that's cool. I've been complaining to all of my friends that all of the movies that I've ever had any interest in seeing in the past couple of years that seem to have all come in the month of January. So I've been to the cinema back to back. Fortunately, I've really enjoyed myself every time. It's been a big range. We actually, obviously this isn't a movie that came out recently, but our local cinema was doing a screening of the London performance of the Sleeping Beauty ballet, which was stunning, and I really enjoyed that. In terms of the movies, they've really varied from the kind of rambunctiously silly that I adore, which is The Gentleman by Guy Ritchie.
I saw the trailer and I thought that looks not good.
Guy Ritchie is definitely one of those ones that everyone kind of tries to rain on his parade, but I'm a staunch defender. They are completely silly from start to finish, and I love watching every second of them. They're so much fun. I saw Uncut Gems, which was pretty brutal. There is violence and kind of graphic things in that movie, but it's just brutal in the sense of how despairing it is and how difficult it is to watch someone. It's about a guy who's a jewellery seller, and he's trying to sell this particular opal that he's come into possession of, and it's he just is incapable of making good decisions for himself, it seems, and it's very painful to watch his whole life fall apart and then seem to get rebuilt, and then it's just a kind of cycle. But I went with a friend who is still deciding whether she thinks it was good or not, but it was certainly compelling. But I did see a review which described it as like having a heart attack for 2 hours, which was kind of the feeling.
Is that good?
Not really, but like this is why we keep discussing whether it was a good movie or not. But I
felt that way about The Master. If you ever saw that, the P.T. Anderson
I'd love
film.
to, yeah.
Well, I'd loved his earlier films. I don't feel a need to go back to There Will Be Blood. I think it's a phenomenal film, but it's ultimately a study of a man's damnation. Mm-hmm. Magnolia is full of horrible stuff, but it's a redemption story, a very profound redemption story. And I watched The Master, and for about 2 years after it, I couldn't figure out if it was a good film or not. And if you are still thinking about a film, it's scratching away in your head 2 years later.
Yeah.
it's probably a very, very good film. So
Yeah. But the one I'll probably touch on last is the one I went to first, which was 1917, which is also
right.
fairly tense and a bit like having a panic attack for about 2 hours. But I did think it was really impressive. I do love like interesting filmmaking techniques and how they did make it feel like it was one shot and in real time, and yet it's more than just the filming technique. It's not just, oh, we did something flashy. The technique serves the story, and the story is very compelling to watch. So yeah, I did like 1917 a lot. So like I said, I probably...
And you've seen Little Women as well.
Yes, I did see Little Women. That was
because you talked about this in
yes,
the podcast.
Exactly. I even forgot. So that's another one. So I've been, 5 times recently? I want to see the David Copperfield movie. I want to see A Hidden Life as well, but I don't know how many more I'll see before I run out of steam. But I'll probably end up spending the rest of the year looking at the listings going, oh, there's nothing I want to see in the cinema.
I think that's typically the way. I used to also always find that January traditionally is the month when people have least money. And it's also the month when all the Oscar films appear.
Yeah. This is bad planning.
Unless cinema is your idea of a cheap night out, that's a problem.
Yeah.
You know. Yeah, no, I want to see Little Women. I'm very keen on seeing that one. And also opening is, I think it's just opened actually, is the Mr. Rogers film with Tom Hanks.
Yes, yeah.
And I'm curious about that one. I had never heard of him before until my wife introduced me to the whole notion of Mr. Rogers and his neighbourhood and so forth. And it looks like it's a film that's going to have a challenge, and I think it's a challenge that they're up for, which is how do you make goodness interesting?
Yeah.
And because I remember I read an interview with Michael Sheen around the time The Good Omens was on television, and he was saying people like to play villains. And he says there's something wrong with us if we can't make goodness interesting.
I really agree.
And
yeah,
I think it's a very profound point. So this film, what I've read about it, about the story it's based on, and I think Tom Hanks is up for the challenge of making goodness interesting.
Yeah. Well, it's been an exciting couple of weeks for cinema anyway. But yes, and I think that's it. Thank you so much for joining us, Greg.
You're very welcome. Thank you for having me.
Greg has a lot more followers on Twitter than I ever will. So I don't know whether there's much use in plugging it, but it's Greg Daly IC or Thirsty Gargoyle.
Yeah, either of those works.
But other than that, thank you very much for listening. Goodbye. This has been Risking Enchantment. Music by Kevin MacLeod. You can follow me on Instagram and Twitter with the handle @SeekingWatson. And you can find out more about me and the podcast at rachelsherlock.com. Thank you and God bless.